Martin Nekola, Dr. Martin Nekola, received his doctorate in political science at Charles University in Prague, the Czech Republic. He spent several months as a postdoctoral research fellow at Columbia University and received a number of research grants in the USA. By the way, I discovered in transporting Martin this morning that he visits the USA lots, like twice a year, and he goes to various universities and puts on presentations for them. He's somebody who really is admired in this particular field. His research is focused on non-democratic regimes, the era of communism, Czech communities abroad, and East European anti-communist exiles in the USA in the early Cold War. From time to time, he participates in election observation missions organized by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. He told me about a couple of those having to do with Ukraine and so on. Very interesting stories. He's the author of more than 300 articles and has published 12 books. He's also the Czechoslovak Talks Project coordinator, and he works closely with the Bohemian National Hall in New York City. Martin.
Yes, that would be good.
Good afternoon. It is a great pleasure to be here. It's my first time when I'm talking in a brewery, so it's a completely new experience. I'm glad it will be recorded so that I have a proof. Yeah, as mentioned, I'm a political scientist and historian born and living in Prague. My main area of research is the Cold War migration or exile from communist Czechoslovakia to Western countries, above all to the United States, but also to Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Thus, I'm doing research on Czechs abroad, on Czech communities settled at various places in various times. You know, the anti-communist exile and the fate of Czechs abroad who sought the return of freedom and democracy to their homeland are an integral part of our modern history, of modern Czech history. However, this topic or this phenomenon is still neglected and the general public has only fragmentary information about it. For me, the exile studies are a great opportunity and almost an unexplored field because they combine a wide range of disciplines: history, sociology, psychology, international relations, literature. I guess that each of us may research and analyze the exile from individual perspectives and aspects. Since I'm a political scientist, I focus primarily on exile politics and everything related to the topic. Political agendas, political organizations, active in the exile, political parties, propaganda, and I'm going to talk about this today as well. I'm not sure how you define the terms in English, but the term emigration in Czech language generally means the voluntary departure from homeland for economic reasons, while exile is the departure for political, ideological, religious, moral and other non-economic reasons. Of course, in reality it's often difficult to separate these two categories. And for example, the modern history of my nation dealt with the migration fairly often. Many Czechs left beginning in the second half of 19th century to find better living conditions in Western Europe or in the United States. And a political emigration or an exile resistance to an oppressive regime played a significant role during both world wars, then after the communist takeover in February 1948, and later after the occupation of Czechoslovakia in August 1968. Now let's make a very brief historical overview so that you have a better idea about the development of Czechoslovakia, the country that doesn't exist anymore. It's been 26 years since it split into two republics, Slovakia and Czechia, although some American journalists still haven't noticed this fact and used to call my country Czechoslovakia. Anyway, as we called it, first Czechoslovak Republic was created on October 28, 1918, at the very end of the World War I, when the Austrian-Hungarian Empire collapsed and was replaced by a number of independent successor states. The Republic was actually born on American soil. because in Pittsburgh, because in 1918 the Czech and Slovak political emigres under the leadership of Professor Tomáš Masaryk, later the first president of Czechoslovakia, and also under the strong influence of Americans of Czech or Slovak descent, signed the famous Pittsburgh Agreement, which became one of the, let's say, founding documents of the Republic. The Czechoslovak economy developed along the lines of the Western capitalist model based on the institution of private property, of land and capital, free private enterprise, the operation of an unrestricted market mechanism, the principle of international division of labor, and moderate social reform. The political system was based on a model of representative, multi-party parliamentary democracy and was strongly influenced by the French, English and American political systems. The second stage of Czechoslovak economic and political development took place between the years 1938 and 1945. After the Munich Agreement signed on September 30th, 1938, the Nazi Germany occupied the border regions or the border territory with the majority of German-speaking population, and Slovakia and Subcarpathian Ruthenia declared themselves autonomous parts of the so-called Second Republic. It lasted only 5 months because on March 15th, 1939, the German army occupied the Czech lands, transferring them into the so-called Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. And the highly industrialized economy of the Czech lands was absorbed into the German war machinery and remained an integral part of it until the end of World War II. Now, with the exception of the Subcarpathian Ruthenia, the eastern part of the Republic, which became the part of the Soviet Union in late 1944, the Czechoslovak Republic was re-established at the end of the war. Between the liberation of the country in May 1945 and the seizure of power by the Communist Party in February 1948, the Czechoslovak economy developed into a system which differed radically from the liberal capitalism of the 1920s and 1930s. First of all, almost 3 million Germans were expelled from Czechoslovakia with the consent of the Allies and were robbed of their possessions. Also, the key industries such as banks, insurance companies, mines, heavy industry were nationalized. Also, land reform de facto destroyed private property, and the post-war period lasting for 3 years was also typified by a rising power of the Communist Party and its orientation towards the Soviet Union. We can ask what were the key elements of the communist success and the defeat of the Democrats. The case of Czechoslovakia shows clearly that the active interest and impressive display of Soviet power, in contrast to the West's hesitant policy, not only formed the background, but were the chief basis for communist successes in Eastern Europe, basically, or in Central Europe, in the whole region. Until the coup in Czechoslovakia, there was a tendency to ascribe communist success in Eastern countries to a lack of democratic traditions and to a social backwardness. The presence of Soviet troops at the time of the communist coup was said to explain the passivity of the Democrats in Eastern European countries. But the coup in Czechoslovakia in February 1948 seemed to be of a different variety. Czechoslovakia was widely known for its democratic traditions and a minimum of social friction. Its highly developed industry was nationalized, as I mentioned, the land reform introduced, and the communists won the semi-democratic election in May 1946. And all of this happened without a revolution, and there were no Soviet troops on Czechoslovak territory when the communists took power. So what was the reason of the failure of democracy in Czechoslovakia and establishment of the red totalitarian regime which lasted for more than 4 decades? First of all, the communists came much better prepared from their exile in Moscow during the World War II. They learned how to penetrate all important sectors, how to occupy the crucial positions in the regional and local governmental bodies. They learned how to work with propaganda, how to convince the people with their unlimited promises to vote for them. And after they won the election in May 1946, they gained control over the most important ministries, the Ministry of Defense, Interior, Information and Agriculture in the coalition government. And they were preparing themselves step by step for the inevitable conflict with their coalition partners, meaning the non-communist parties and pro-Western politicians. While the communists were receiving direct support and instructions from Moscow, instructions on how to proceed, the Democrats felt internationally isolated. You know, both France and Great Britain had to deal with political crisis at home and the loss of their, let's say, global colonial empires, and had only limited interest in Central Europe, which fell, in addition, into the sphere of Soviet influence, as agreed at the Yalta Conference between Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin in February 1945. The United States, as a potential ally and closest friend, was simply too far away, and despite of some moral support from the US Embassy in Prague, the Czechoslovak Democrats simply didn't have a strong protector from abroad as the communists had. Some of them believed that Czechoslovakia would, thanks to its strategic position in the very heart of Europe, it would play the role of the bridge between the West and the East, the mediator or meeting point where imminent conflicts could be solved. Let's say, naive expectations of Czechoslovak Democrats that their country could become another Switzerland, independent, neutral, and with its own foreign policy, were quickly dispersed. Because the communists, under their leader, Klement Gottwald, who became the prime minister after the election in 1946, planned to seize absolute power and were just waiting for the right moment. It happened to be the governmental crisis which developed in late February 1948. 12 non-communist ministers from 3 parties resigned in protest against the activities of communist-controlled security police. In normal circumstances, the president would have accepted their resignations and held new elections. However, the communists feared defeat, so they used threats to prevent elections, as did the Soviet Union through a diplomat, Zorin, sent to Prague, who threatened a Soviet invasion if Moscow's orders were not followed. Also, the communist-controlled labor unions marched their supporters out onto the streets of Prague and other cities. The communists also arranged a general strike. They took control in outlying areas and eliminated any resistance by democratic elements in the society. And then it was over. You know, the government had 26 members, and since only a minority, 12 members resigned, then the democracy has been defeated because the president, his name was Edvard Beneš, he was a Democrat and a pro-Western politician, but he decided not to risk a Soviet invasion or a civil war, and simply surrendered and accepted the resignation of 12 ministers, but replaced them by the people who were nominated by the communist prime minister. You know, so the Czechoslovak, let's say, democratic experiment in the Soviet bloc was over, and 41 years of oppression began. Stalin directed the Czechoslovak communists to carry out purges, and the nation held the largest show trials in Eastern Europe. Over a 6-year period between 1949 until 1954-55, the victims of these trials included military leaders, Catholics, Jews, democratic politicians, people with the wartime connections with the West, as well as high-ranking communists. And almost 180 people were executed. Farmers, especially the wealthy ones, referred to as the kulaks, were enemies of the new regime, and during the years of Stalinization, farms were nationalized in what was called the collectivization process. No one could own more than 120 acres of land. While the lives of richer peasants were destroyed, poor peasants were excited by the system, you know, because the communists also blackmailed farmers and threatened them with imprisonment if they did not join the newly established cooperatives. And the poor ones were happy because now they had more land for free. The communists also took over church property. They closed all 216 monasteries in the country, and they were persecuting the clergy. Communist ideology also permeated the politically based education system. The students had to study subjects such as Marxism-Leninism. Applicants were accepted into universities if they had working class backgrounds, if they supported communist regime and had participated in communist youth organizations, and we can easily continue. The fact is that the long era of communism in Czechoslovakia had a devastating effect on the nation's soul and character, which is visible even today. Another important topic related to this takeover by the communists is the emigration, or better to say, the exile. Because from the moment of the governmental crisis I mentioned in February 48, the floodgates of communist oppression opened, and the first democratic politicians, journalists, academics, high governmental officials, simply people who criticized the methods of the Reds, did not hesitate, to leave Czechoslovakia before they could be imprisoned. In the search for accurate data on this, we call it post-February exile, we encounter widely varying statistics. Because the researchers and historians are still unable to agree on a magnitude of individual waves of migration between 1948 until the fall of the Iron Curtain in 1989. Some authors work with a very rough number, and I would say an overestimated number of 500,000 of Czechs and Slovaks who left the country. I think that 250, maybe 300,000 people would be a more realistic figure. The official estimate of Czechoslovak state security by the end of the year 1948 states about 8,600 people who legally left the country, and for the period of between 1948 and 1953, so the first 5 years of the communist regime, state security lists a total number of 43,000 people who emigrated. I think that 50, maybe 60,000 would be probably more real number. Now, the first steps in the free world brought these people into the so-called displaced person camps in the Western occupation zones of Germany or Austria or in Italy. These facilities were under the administration of the International Refugee Organization, the IRO, one of the United Nations agencies based in Switzerland. And between 1947 in 1952, basically the whole refugee agenda in Western Europe was under the control of the IRO. In July 48, the IRO granted the status of political refugees also to the Czechs and Slovaks with the same legal protection and benefits as the other prior residents of the camps, meaning the Baltic people, the Ukrainians, the Poles, the Bulgarians, Romanians, Hungarians. It's almost half-forgotten fact that more than 20 million people were in Europe were out of their home countries by the end of World War II. This included former forced laborers returning from Germany, expelled German minorities, and above all, people escaping from Stalin or from the communist regimes in the East, behind the Iron Curtain. Therefore, the International Refugee Organization and many humanitarian organizations and refugee funds faced an enormous task. The displaced person camps were meant to host only one nationality. For example, there were separate Latvian camps or separate Polish or Ukrainian camps, but in most cases, several nationalities were living together, and the Czechs and Slovaks ended up in various locations. As you can see on the pictures, the accommodation for refugees met only very basic requirements. We are talking about wooden shacks, former prisoner of war camps, military barracks, schools, factories, or even more primitive types of housing, such as tents, train cars, etc. The prominent Czechoslovak emigres with high-level information useful to U.S. intelligence services were gathered in the so-called Alaska House. That was a villa in the suburbs of Frankfurt. The newly arrived emigres or refugees were carefully interviewed and given some degree of of protection, or they were declared ineligible for the protection by the IRO. We need to understand that the atmosphere in these camps was extremely tense, because there was a widespread belief that the Cold War would quickly change into an armed conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. But the time passed, and people still remained for long months or even years behind the walls and the fences of these camps, sending visa applications and waiting for work permits and transport to a new home. We also need to remember that Western Europe still lay in ruins. The economy was painfully slow in recovering from the war, and production at factories stalled, and unemployment was very high. French politics, for example, was confused by a permanent constitutional crisis, and suddenly the same countries, France, Netherlands, even Great Britain, were to be hit by a massive influx of immigrants. Of course, they were not prepared for that, and the population did not hide their fears. So refugees looked beyond the boundaries of Europe. A dream destination number one was the United States of America, of course, but immigrant quotas were very strict, so more and more people were going to Latin America, to Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. These countries were looking for fresh blood and experts in a wide range of disciplines, so medical doctors, engineers, craftsmen had open doors. To South Africa, for example, while workers in factories and timber plants were cordially invited to Canada. In my opinion, the life in these DP camps deserves much further research. I would liken it to a unique microcosm where you could have found black market, prostitution, violent and boozy clashes between the people, as well as churches, chapels, libraries, schools, kindergartens, sport associations, scout troops. To make the story short, the life of Czechs and Slovaks in the camps was very interesting, and I'm actually writing a book about it. In the DP camps, also the first magazines were published, and also the first seeds of political activity were born. Now, while doing my research on the Czechoslovak exile and its developments, I began to think in a broader period, in a broader way about the Cold War emigres from all the countries behind the Iron Curtain, and I began to question how the Czechoslovak experience was unique and specific in comparison to the Polish, Hungarian, Bulgarian, or Baltic emigres. Political immigration has played a prominent role in the modern history of all countries in the region of Central Europe, as well as the Central European, let's say, ethnic presence in the United States. Between 1890s and the outbreak of the World War I, Central, Southern and Eastern Europe accounted for about 70% of total American immigration. Later, the number of incomers from this region decreased a bit, but still, in 1930s, there were about 2 million of first and second generation of Poles living in America, about 1 million of Czechs and Slovaks, 300,000 Hungarians, 250,000 Yugoslavs, 150,000 people coming from Romania, etc., etc. And after the Yalta Conference in 1945, a large number of political emigres who already had experienced communist rule were convinced that the Yalta agreements were not conducive to an independent and democratic existence for the Eastern European countries, so they rather decided to leave and to remain in the West, and didn't return to their homelands after the liberation from Nazis, and watched the irreversible Sovietization from afar. As you know, the communists backed by Moscow took power in Albania, Romania and Bulgaria in 1945. Hungary and Poland followed soon after. And Czechoslovakia fell as the very last limited pluralist democracy in February 1948, as I mentioned. The former politicians, diplomats, high government officials, military officials left the country and started another struggle for freedom and democracy in the exile. At first, they settled in Munich, in Paris and London, but soon after the, let's say, headquarters of the exile activities moved overseas to New York City or Washington, D.C. In the USA, in December 1947, the newly formed National Security Council warned that the Soviet Union was conducting an intensive propaganda campaign directed primarily against the United States, employing coordinated psychological, political and economic measures designed to undermine non-communist elements in Europe and elsewhere. And the only response available to weaken and to roll back this communist influence was to initiate a psychological offensive in return. George Kennan, also called the architect of the Cold War, presented the document called the Inauguration of Organized Political Warfare at a national security meeting on May 4th, 1948, in the presence of President Truman. And Kennan highlighted the importance of providing assistance for all liberation committees, underground activities behind the Iron Curtain, and the support of anti-communist elements in threatened countries in the free world. So these were the roots of the organization called the National Committee for Free Europe. The founders of this organization were initially not totally certain of its exact purpose and functions. They knew that this committee would not provide humanitarian aid to refugees from the Eastern country or Eastern European countries or help with applications for US visas. Instead, it would focus on a chosen group of anti-fascist and anti-communist political leaders who had successfully made it to America to find appropriate employment and make use of their knowledge and abilities during their stay. The committee's Articles of Association were signed in New York on May 17, 1949, and at the first press conference, this 4-point program was introduced. So, through the founding of the National Committee for Free Europe, the political, organizational and operational groundwork for all forms of anti-Soviet and anti-communist activities was in place. Financial aid was also assured. Donations officially came from private donors as well as large corporations such as Chevrolet, Ford Motor Company, General Electric, Chase National Bank. But above all, there was the behind-the-scenes support from the Department of State and the CIA. If you look at the chart or program of the National Committee, it becomes obvious that a lot of money went to exile organizations to finance their activities. We can say that there were 3 types of political organizations involved in the anti-communist campaigns. It was the political parties that re-established themselves in the exile, then the national committees, and then the internationals or supranational organizations. Political parties, the representatives of the parties either dissolved or morphed into harmless satellites of communist parties, simply tried to pick up their activities in exile and to rebuild broken structures. They were working in very modest surroundings with very limited funds and the lack of human apparatus. So the daily operations, publishing of the party material, ways of communication with the member base, all had to be radically adapted. But almost all banned parties began to establish themselves in the early days in the refugee camps. For example, there is the list of all socialist parties, that were established in the exile, and it's just one part of the political spectrum. Also, the conservative parties, the monarchist parties, the small peasant parties or smallholders parties, they were also reestablished in the camps, and they began. They were active in France and Britain, and later in America or Canada. Party meetings were organized. The information sheets and brochures were printed and circulated, and party structures were slowly redeveloped. The party headquarters shifted constantly according to the place of residence of their leaders, or there were several centers of power at the same time, sometimes accepting the authority of the party executive committee or chairman, but sometimes building an inner opposition group pursuing its own independent policy. So the life of these exile subjects or entities was often turbulent and exhausted by internal strife, by expulsion of dissidents and criticism of the leadership. However, these parties retained a key role in the exile community, and the first initiatives towards supranational cooperation came from them. Another type of the exile organizations are the national committees, because the integration on the basis of national umbrella organizations was perceived as a further necessary condition for the launch of exile activities. As you can see, virtually every national group of emigres found its committee or council in late 1940s, accumulating various personalities and democratic political streams, from socialists to monarchists, and many similar characteristics are to be found. Typically, the management comprised a board of 15 to 20 members, recruited from among former statesmen, party and governmental officials, senior civil servants, etc., etc. A high percentage had also been diplomats, representing their homelands in missions abroad before the communist takeovers. And once they had received instructions from the new red governments, they often disobeyed and refused to leave their offices. And their experience and knowledge at the international level proved crucial during negotiations with the Western governments. Each committee also had its own offices with a paid staff in New York City or Washington, D.C. The numbers of staff varied widely, depending, again, mainly on the financial support of the US government. And the activities of these committees consisted of lobbying American officials and compatriot associations in the interest of Eastern European emigres, participating in various cultural, educational and memorial events, and maintaining an intensive information campaign in the media. To be sure, the most important information/propaganda channel which developed from the cooperation between the US authorities and the emigre communities was Radio Free Europe. And the importance of its Cold War broadcasting was gradually increased. Its services provided a source of scarce objective information about what was really happening behind the Iron Curtain. It also served as a think tank where emigres had the opportunity to share their ideas and analysis. It also served as a center of exile culture and as a social environment in general. There were 5 national desks of the Radio Free Europe. There was a Czechoslovak desk, Bulgarian, Hungarian, Polish and Romanian, whose decades-long broadcasting ranked among the phenomena of modern journalism, I would say. On the other hand, exile committees faced a constant lack of finances, again, the internal crisis and conflicts. There were a lot of petty quarrels and personal animosities, arguments about the legitimacy of leading bodies, and a crippling absence of charismatic leadership. In fact, none of these committees found itself in an ideal situation in the long run. Committee names, official periodicals, and personal composition changed during the long years in the exile. Generally, probably the Hungarians were able to achieve perhaps the greatest measure of solidarity in their Hungarian National Council. It was located in Washington, D.C. It was headed by Monsignor Bela Varga, and unlike similar exile organizations, the council successfully included politicians from right and left, as well as from different periods of Hungarian political history, including former collaborators with the Nazis or ultra-conservatives from as early as the years of the Habsburg Empire. On the opposite end, the Polish emigres were split into 3 factions: the shadow government in exile in London, its opposition, that was called the Council of National Unity, which accepted the legality of the exile government, but not its narrow representation. And finally, the so-called Polish Democratic Committee in Washington under former Prime Minister Stanislav Mikołajczyk. The Romanian National Committee, with the headquarters in DC, labored under the handicap that the majority of the Romanian emigres were far right and had considerable, sympathy for the Iron Guard, as you know, the extremist organization responsible for the Holocaust in Romania in wartime. The leadership of the Romanian Council, moreover, was rather conservative, faithful to the King Michael I. And very important thing, they also succeeded in taking a part of the Romanian golden treasury with them into the exile in Switzerland and then to France. So compared to the other groups, they had adequate funds, to launch their campaigns. On February 25th, 1949, exactly 1 year after the communist takeover in Czechoslovakia, also the Council of Free Czechoslovakia was established in DC. Former mayor of Prague, Peter Zenkel, became its chairman. And after a promising start and a strong support from the Department of State, the activities of the council quickly shrank. It had naive expectations that it would receive recognition comparable to that which the government in exile had during the World War II. Some tensions still hang in the air, the result of the defeat of the democratic camp in February 48, some frustration, fear, and unfortunately also settling of old scores between old political rivals. And the fact that the council suffered from fragmentation and conflicts, it was fatally reflected in its activities. And throughout 1950s and 1960s, the council was in a permanent crisis. It fell apart and reunited again. And the members wasted time with endless quarrels, which led to the loss of confidence of the exile public and also of their American donors and supporters. In the, let's say, glasshouse environment of the exile, where leaders of political parties lost feedback from their voters, they were lacking a clear vision, terms, and working apparatus. It was these backstage negotiations, unfulfilled ambitions, personal animosities, old friendships, and old injustice that formed the basic pillars of the exile politics, unfortunately. The National Committee for Free Europe began to provide monthly financial support to each committee for the cost of administration, travel expenses, information and social services. This was a generous but also a strict patron, and the money also became an effective instrument of pressure. If, in subsequent years, any of the committees did not respect the recommendations and demands of the Council, the Americans first appealed for and then strongly urged changes before ultimately cutting back on their subsidies if it became clear that the desired results would not be forthcoming. And here we reached the main point, and it showed up quickly. The exile committees were not very effective in their activities. They were beset by internal problems, as I said, and many of the politicians still did not understand that they were no longer in charge, and they continued to act as if they were prime ministers or chairmen of political parties, and demanded complete loyalty and obedience. They always had a camp of their supporters and also the camp of opponents, so permanent crises of these committees were nothing unusual. So the American sponsors were dissatisfied with these conditions, and they decided to elevate the exile anti-communist campaign to a higher level, represented by supranational bodies, where the Albanians and the Czechs and the Poles could cooperate together under one roof, could act more effectively, and of course could be also more easily controlled. So in subsequent years, meaning early 1950s, many common projects unifying the emigres came to life under the supervision of the National Committee for Free Europe. For example, there was this information campaign called Crusade for Freedom, warning the American public about the communist menace. There was a Free Europe College, providing university education to talented students among the emigres. There were many publications, such as the monthly journal called News from Behind the Iron Curtain, and of course there was the broadcasting of the Radio Free Europe. All of this was devised and funded by the National Committee, and in all of these, the leaders of the exile communities, the members of the national committees participated as editors, analysts, lecturers. The efforts of the National Committee to unite more closely East European exiles and to give the appearance that they spoke with one voice in line with US foreign policy continued and strengthened. On February 11th, 1951, altogether 202 exile representatives signed the so-called Declaration of the Aims and Principles of Liberation of the Central and Eastern European Peoples in Independence Hall in Philadelphia. This was a symbolic act, but the American media and the public were very attentive to it. There were fears that World War II and the years preceding had exposed many reasons for distrust and bitterness. Nevertheless, the complicated relations between the Poles and the Czechs, Hungarians and Romanians did not prevent a common front against the communist enemy, fortunately. These people, the exiled politicians, were ready to set out the grounds for a peaceful transition to a post-communist future, ideally involving a gradual process towards the federalization of the whole European continent. And as we see now, it worked. You know, we have the European Union. And after the political parties and national committees, the third type of organizations was created. It was the internationals. Because the visions of, well, it's complicated to explain here, since we have only two political parties, but, you know, in most European countries, the political spectrum is very varied. So the visions of agrarians, Christian Democrats, liberals or socialists about the ideal organization of society and the development of the countries and the entire European continent varied, logically enough. But several central themes, such as the overthrow of the communist regimes and subsequent peaceful economic and political integration, remained a constant across the party lines. However, the specific steps how to achieve their goals depended on the ideological beliefs of specific émigré politicians. As described earlier, the political parties in exile faced serious difficulties and had no choice but to look for allies among like-minded counterparts. So that was the impulse towards the creation of various internationals based on common ideological or professional backgrounds. To be specific, exiled Christian Democrats established the so-called Christian Democratic Union of Central Europe. Altogether 18 agrarian, smallholder and peasant parties resumed their work in exile and agreed to found the International Peasant Union, also called the Green International. The Socialists or the Social Democrats had the same with the Socialist Union. Union workers were under the umbrella of the International Center of Free Trade Unions in exile, and the list could be easily expanded. And all these organizations were based here in America, in New York or Washington. And it was not only the professional politicians who felt the need to be organized on a supranational level. A number of professional or guild internationals were founded. For writers, for journalists, for former political prisoners, for professors, students, you know, again, it's only one part of the list. And these coordination efforts also resulted in the organization called the Assembly of Captive European Nations in New York City, which officially saw the light of the day on September 20th, 1954. As non-incorporated, non-profit company, the Assembly was intended to act as a shadow counterbalance to the United Nations. It was meant to coordinate the management of anti-communist campaigns, to publicize news from behind the Iron Curtain, and to generate international support for the liberation of Soviet-ruled parts of Europe. The structure of ASEN generally followed the structure of the United Nations. It consisted of a General Assembly, General Committee, and several working committees. The general sessions were held once a year, usually in September, and these worked as a sanctioning assemblies through which resolutions were announced and the members of the General Committee were elected. Various lectures and situational reports on developments in individual countries behind the Iron Curtain were presented, and voting on the resolutions and protests took place at these sessions as well. They took place in New York City to coincide with the United Nations General Assembly sessions, and were frequently also coordinated with public demonstrations, to raise their profile and increase the volume of their message. Between 1956 and 1963, Eisen rented a two-story building owned by the Carnegie Endowment on First Avenue, directly opposite the United Nations headquarters. Hence, the UN delegates from communist countries simply could not avoid the unpleasant view of posters and billboards hanging across the street that alerted passers-by to the ongoing Red Terror and Soviet imperialism. As mentioned, the democratic and liberal politicians had made the United States the focus of their liberation efforts. The organizations I mentioned did not aspire to determine the future political and economic structure for their countries, but aimed to bring about a situation wherein the people would be able to decide, without foreign interference, the form of government they wanted to live under. Naturally, there were different views and disagreements about what would constitute an effective liberation. The conservative and extremist part of the exile community claimed that only a complete eradication of communism would assure it. The majority, however, said that many of the economic and social changes introduced under the communists would have to stay because they had become a part of each nation's life. But they demanded a free elections, of course. And some emigres or some emigre politicians even began to argue that liberation might well come from a gradual democratization of the communist regimes. The hopes for the liberation, even with the risk of an armed conflict between Soviet Union and America, ran highest during the 1952 presidential campaign or presidential election between Dwight Eisenhower and Adlai Stevenson. During this election, there was much talk about the liberation of Eastern Europe, and the votes from American Czechs, Poles, Hungarians sent the Republican candidate to the White House because they expected that Eisenhower would take a tough stance against the Soviets. After Stalin's death in March 1953, it seemed that opportunities for change in particular countries of the Soviet bloc would open up. The first attempts were seen in the German Democratic Republic in Eastern Germany, where in June 1953 there were serious social protests which involved about 400,000 people in 250 locations across the country, including East Berlin. They were pacified very quickly as a result of the Soviet military intervention, but it was a first serious blow to the hopes and naive expectations of the emigres. The other one was the Geneva Summit of July 1955, where the representatives of the Big Four of United States, Soviet Union, France and Great Britain met for the first time in a decade following the end of World War II. Before the summit, the Western leaders were swamped with telegrams and resolutions from various exile organizations demanding that the problem of liberation be put on the agenda. Although Eisenhower seemed to be open to the suggestion, the issue of liberation wasn't raised in Geneva. Moreover, the summit was followed by a period of disappointments when communist Albania, Hungary, Bulgaria and Romania were admitted to the United Nations, and there was the failure of the West to intervene effectively in the Polish and Hungarian uprisings in 1956, which also raised the question whether there was room for political exiles and their activities in the world where conflicting systems tolerated one another. The Cold War and the communist supremacy over Eastern Europe lasted for 4 decades, even more than that, and the majority of the people I'm doing research on, these fighters for freedom and democracy, didn't live to see the fall of the Iron Curtain in the fall of 1989. Therefore, we historians need to catalog their efforts and make sure that their work will not be forgotten. Thank you very much.
So Martin is happy to take some questions from the audience. Please wait for the microphone because we are filming this and we'd like to get your question as well as his answer on the film. So, questions?
Thank you. Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. And what I'd like to ask is something about speculation from a perspective of 1989 and some of the things you described and the knowledge that you know about historical aspects of political parties. You talk a little bit about each country had their own individual take on what they wanted to do in regards to receiving freedom or help or lobbying the United States. And then later on in the 50s, consolidating to try to work as a united front to try to get more support from that perspective. Do you feel that there are certain points in the timeline that if that had happened earlier, that would have been resulting in something that would be more positive for that task, or would that have been a problem with Stalin still being in control, where more people would have died? Is there anything from that perspective, or where you see 1979, 1969 could have been an earlier release or breaking or cracking of the Soviet system? If there's anything that you see from all the pieces that are involved in the timeline.
I see personally the year 1956 and the Hungarian uprising as a very important turning point. All the organizations and periodicals I mentioned in my talk, they were active mostly in early 1950s. After 1956, the people simply, so what would happen now? The West apparently would not come to liberate our countries. So what now? So many of them simply, abandoned the exile politics and they focused rather on their social and family life here in the US. They became American citizens because they knew that their exile would last for many years. And 1956 completely changed the inner atmosphere of the exile. Until then, the people still had some hope. They were expecting to come back. They were ready to fight. After 1956, it was just gone. When another 200,000 Hungarians arrived to Austria and then to the West, so that was it. 1968, Czechoslovakia, the invasion of Czechoslovakia was another thing. And it's actually interesting because now we had two generations of the emigres: the post-48ers or the 48ers, and then the 68ers. The part of the 1968 exile community were former communists, and they arrived to the West, and now the conservative, the 48ers said, well guys, now you're here with us, you were, betrayed by your fellows. So it wasn't easy, and of course the inner atmosphere wasn't friendly at all, because there were some conservatives who said, well, we need to destroy the communists, and only an armed conflict would solve that problem. And the new ones, the former communists, said, the communist regime is not the same as in late 40s, as you were living in the country. There were some liberation efforts, there is a new generation of the communist leaders. Simply wait, maybe we will just reach a point when the borders will be open again and we'll be able to talk to each other. That didn't happen until 1989, because Czechoslovakia, together with Eastern Germany, was considered the most rigid and the most conservative countries of the Soviet bloc. You know that in Poland and Hungary, the semi-free elections took place in 1988, right, or many months before. The change was visible in Czechoslovakia. So in the Czechoslovak case, 1956 for the emigres, and then 1968 for the Czechs living in the country. They were very important turning points, and after 68 we call the whole period lasting for 2 decades normalization period. When the communists just needed to expel the bad communists and just to normalize the atmosphere so that everyone is happy. You'll have bread, you'll have games, but you need to be obedient. That was it. I was born in 1982, so I was like 6 or 7 when the Iron Curtain fell. But I still have some flashbacks, some fragments from my childhood, how Prague looked like in late 1980s. You have probably been to Prague. Now it's a typical Western European city, beautiful city. But I still see this, foggy city covered by dust. Everything was grey, everything was so hostile. So that was it. Yeah. Please.
Thank you very much. My wife and I were just in Prague a couple of months ago.
Cool.
And it is a beautiful, beautiful city. It's incredible. But my question revolves around the separation of Czechoslovakia into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And it was our understanding from the people we spoke to while we were in Prague that it was something that happened overnight. It just happened very quickly. Many people didn't know it was even coming. How does this fit into the historical time frame of your country?
First of all, I have to say that today the relations between the Czechs and Slovaks are probably the best in our history. We are both in the European Union, there are no boundaries, no restrictions, so there are mixed couples. Slovak students can study Czech universities, there are no problems, we understand each other, it's almost the same language, so it's all good. But I understand that the Slovaks felt some need, to have an independent state, since they were under the Hungarian rule for more than 300 years. They got their state during World War II, but it was, kind of a puppet state of the Nazi Germany, so that really doesn't count. And then after the revolution, the let's say nationalistic sentiment grew up again, and some of the political leaders, the Slovak political leaders, said, well, now it's a great moment, we got rid of the communists, so now give us the independent state. And the Czechs said, well, why not? Because we, in early 90s, there was this very bad civil war in Yugoslavia, so we didn't want to end up like that. And the split was peaceful. It happened within a few months. It wasn't overnight, but it lasted about 4 or 5 months when the representatives just, reached an agreement how to do it. And yeah, since January 1st, 1993, we have 2 republics, and it's all fine now.
Thank you. You spoke earlier about President Beneš's concern about the Soviets invading if he stood up to them. There is a perception, at least in this country, that Beneš was a different president after the war than he was before. Could Beneš, or let me ask it a little differently, was Beneš an effective leader, or had he become less effective and made it easier for the communists to take over?
He was a very smart guy, and he was a foreign minister in 1920s and 1930s, and then he became president in December 1935 when the first president Masaryk just resigned. He was a very smart guy, but some historians say that he counted on the alliance with the British and with the French too much. There were other options. There was an option to build some kind of Central European confederacy with Poland. There were chances to enhance our relations with the Austrians, but he still relied on the French and on the British, and it didn't work, as we saw in 1938 when we say that the West betrayed us and that they sold us to Hitler. And I think that this betrayal remained in Beneš's head, in Beneš's mind. So he understood that he needs to find another allies. And who was the closest ally? Probably Stalin, who offered him everything. Do you want to expel your Germans? Sure, you have it. So Beneš signed a treaty with the Soviets in December 1943. Then it was even enhanced in January 1945, and that was it. From that moment, Czechoslovakia was standing in the middle, but everyone understood that it's, our foreign policy is more Soviet-oriented. And as I mentioned, the British and the French had another problems to solve after the end of the war. So, we were in the middle, we were in Central Europe, but we were part of the Soviet sphere of influence without any doubts. And still, between 1945 and 48, Beneš might have thought that he might play it, very smart, and that he might keep the republic still between the two world powers, but it didn't work. And the democratic camp simply abandoned him again in February 48. He was left alone, and he had to make the final decision. Shall I accept the resignation of the ministers or not? And he simply looked out of the window and he saw, the communists marching on the streets of Prague. And he was in the very same situation as 10 years earlier during the Munich crisis. It was his decision as well, just to step back and to let the Germans to occupy the border regions. There was no parliament decision, there was no government decision, it was his own decision. Because, they just forced him to make this decision. And the same happened 10 years later. So I think President Beneš is a very important man in our history, and he's also controversial. And the question is if his merits and if the work he have done during the World War I, he held many diplomatic negotiations with Western politicians, and he was the one who sat behind the desk and who was writing all the notes and all the letters to Western leaders. So he is number one in terms of merits when we established the First Republic in 1918. But then his decisions in 1938 and 1948 are very problematic, and there are still many books, published by Czech and foreign historians and political scientists who still try to get into Beneš's head. So what was he thinking? Why did he do that? Why did he allow the communists to take absolute power? It's never ending story, I guess.
Talked about the West betraying with Hitler, and I'd like to ask you about the West betraying with Stalin. I was in Poland a few months ago and had a tour of Nowa Huta area, and the comments of Churchill making a deal with Stalin because he had to, and the breakup of Poland and Czechoslovakia, all the countries that then for the next 40 years had to try to work through that. What is the perception of that? Do you feel people, maybe your parents' generation, feel that the West betrayed those that tried to fight to get rid of the Germans, and then we're told, sorry, but here's your new landlord, I suppose, or some kind of comment like that?
There's another very important factor, and that's a pro-Russian sentiment, among the Czech population, because the Russians were seen as kind of a protector during Austrian times. We were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and some of our politicians were traveling to Russia, and they were, accepted by the Tsar, and they relied that the Russians, the big Slavic, brother, would come one day to liberate us. Again, the languages are not the same, but it's not too complicated to learn Russian or to read in Russian. So the late 19th century politicians, Czech politicians, were in touch with the Russian counterparts. This sentiment remained during the World War I because we expected that the great Russian Tsarist army would liberate us. Then we had this Czechoslovak Legion that was fighting in Siberia against the Bolsheviks. So we still had some kind of Czech connections, and first of all, the Red Army liberated 85% of Czechoslovak territory in 1944. So that was it. The Soviets were seen as liberators, as the greatest friends, although they took the Subcarpathian Ruthenia, they just annexed it. but we saw that as part of the game, that we simply had to, give them something, because many, 400,000 Soviet soldiers lost their lives during the liberation operations of Czechoslovakia. So that was it, and I think that the people actually liked the Russians until 1968. They just saw them that the communist takeover was mostly the operation of our Czechoslovak communists. That the Russians were, sending their troops to the border, and they were waiting what would happen. But it was our decision that we supported the Communist Party. As I said, the communists won the election, fairly democratic election. So that was it. After 1968, it changed. The Russians were seen as aggressors, as occupiers, and since then the sentiment is gone. And you mentioned the generation of my parents, who are now late 50s, 60s. They see the Russians as kind of enemies. Maybe you have noticed there was a big issue just a few weeks ago in Prague. There is a big statue of Marshal Koněv, whose troops liberated Czechoslovakia, and this statue was standing in a park in Prague 6 downtown for past 70 years, and suddenly the city council decided to move it elsewhere, to leave the park. It was shitstorm, and the Russian embassy got involved, and the communists marched, and they wanted to protect the statue, they were standing like a human chain, no, Marshal Koněv will stay here. He would say one stupid statue, and what could cause it, so that clearly showed that this pro/anti-Russian feelings are still present in the Czech society.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. Could you tell us again about how many Czechoslovakians came to the U.S. During the period? And then where are they now? Where is there a concentration of them in the United States?
We start to count the Czech migration to the US in the 1850s. After the revolution in 1848, there were some liberalization efforts. It didn't work out. So many Czechs left the country, and they went to Western Europe and in America. Between 1850s and 1914, the outbreak of World War I, we are talking about 350,000 Czechs that moved to America. They arrived to New York City and then just took a train to get settled in Ohio, Pennsylvania, or Michigan, or Illinois, in Chicago, of course. Chicago was considered the largest Czech city outside of Bohemia. There were about 130,000 Czechs living in Chicago, plus another 70,000 in Berwyn and Cicero, the suburbs. The other part went to Galveston, Galveston, Texas, and from there, to buy the cheap farmland in Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, basically the Midwest states. Then we had the 1948 wave of migration. I think 20,000 people arrived to the US, and then another 20 or 25,000 after the Soviet invasion in '68. So altogether, probably 400,000. And the second and third generation people with some kind of Czech origins. Today, it's about 2 million people, 2.5 million people who knew that their ancestors came from Bohemia, but they don't speak anymore. Of course, they may maintain some kind of Czech traditions, mostly in Texas. There are many small Czech museums and archives and associations in Texas, and they still keep these traditions. They wear the traditional costumes. They bake the kolaches, kind of cakes, and they're very proud of it. But the Czech communities are gone in bigger cities. In Chicago, New York, Milwaukee, St. Louis, Cleveland, Ohio, they had some strong Czech communities back before the World War II, sorry. But since 1950s, it just disappeared because the people got assimilated, and the kids, the younger generations, they were not so much interested to keep the knowledge of the Czech language, so it just disappeared. But for me as a historian, it's fascinating. You know, I come to the US like 2 or 3 times a year, and every time I discover something new, small Czech archive or museum. On Friday I was in Baltimore. There is a big Czech cemetery. There's a small museum in kind of a hut or a cabin full of incredible Czech fragments. You know, posters, photographs, diaries, chronicles. Wow, incredible. We have a Czech and Slovak National Museum in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. It's kind of an umbrella organization that should take care of all the small archives. But I think it's Cedar Rapids, Iowa, right? So no one would actually go to explore the Czech past to Iowa. It's in the middle of the fields. Well, but that's how it is. And the Slovaks, they claim they have even more Slovaks or people of Slovak origins living outside of Slovakia. 5 million Slovaks, and they say that about 7 million people of Slovak heritage are living outside. Yes. When we are 10.5 million Czechs and 5 million Slovaks, just to an idea.
Yeah. How do the Czechs and other Eastern Europeans feel about the United States' relationship with Russia right now? Putin and Trump. Let's get a little political here, why not? You know, this is Washington area. But you know, how do they feel about that relationship? And also, on the other side of that coin, our withdrawal from NATO, or it's not a withdrawal, but it's a lack of commitment, let's say, that we used to show to NATO and the European Union. Is there a sentiment there?
Am I allowed to talk about it? I'm in a Republican state, right?
This is America. I guess you're allowed to talk about it, but you know, now I'm not sure. Yeah, I mean, we don't have
Signal inside, okay.
Yeah, we don't know anymore. I mean, you know, we're all at risk.
You know, with everything that happened to my nation and to my country during the 20th century, America was still kind of a friend, you know, behind the ocean that helped us to get a republic, the first independent state in 1918. So we saw you as protectors and friends. They were not able to help us every time we needed, but still that there were some, you know, close ties and some relations. Trump, well, also he has also some Czech connection, as you know, because his first wife Ivana is Czech, and the kids Donald Jr., Eric, and Ivanka were, you know, Czech speakers, like they knew Czech. And in late 80s and early 90s, they used to spend summer holidays in Moravia, in the eastern part of Czechia, with their grandparents, with their grandfather. You know? So these princes and princesses from Wall Street, you know, they were just playing with local kids in the forests. Incredible. So now, I don't know, I'm on a lecture tour, and I give a talk about populism in the Czech Republic and the European Union today, which is also related to your question. Because now we are in a very strange times that the populist leaders are, you know, strengthening their positions. Our Prime Minister, his name is Andrej Babiš, he's a billionaire, he's the second wealthiest man in Czechia, and he's the Prime Minister now. And his company, the conglomerate called Agrofert, it's a conglomerate of about 230 companies, is simply drawing billions of euros from the EU budget, from the investment funds. You would say it's not possible, you know, it's like in the ancient times under the Habsburgs, but still it's possible. And the type of politicians like Babiš or like Trump or like Johnson or like Orbán are now in charge. They are now in power. We have kind of a populist, you know, wave that is visible globally in many countries, in Asia, in Latin America. So my colleagues, political scientists and historians, they don't know how to explain it to the students or how to explain to the broader public. You know, I got my PhD in political science in 2012, and all the political theories and all the books I had to read, they don't work anymore. You know, it's not true anymore because the political scene has changed so much in past few years. We had, for 25 years, we have two major political parties. The Social Democrats as the main party on the left and Civic Democrats as the main party on the right. But since 2013, number of protest parties and anti-establishment movements just, got into the parliament, and they have stronger and stronger support among younger voters, among the first-time voters. And the ANO party, Babiš founded the party called ANO, which means yes in Czech, but it's also the actions of dissatisfied citizens. This ANO movement won the election in October 2017, and since then he's a prime minister, and he has 30% of support, and the second party has about 11% of support, or 12. So there's a huge gap between ANO. Guess why? Because he raised the pensions, he raised the salaries, you know. Although we know now that there's no money to fulfill his promises, simply the people like it, and they will vote for him again. Although the generation of my kids will have to pay the debts, right? But no one can see it now. Yeah.
Anyone else?
My wife and I were in Prague a couple of years ago, and they talked a lot about the Velvet Revolution. And I wonder if you could expand on that just a little bit for me.
Yeah, actually next week or 2 weeks we are celebrating the 30th anniversary of the Velvet Revolution since 1989. Again, some people say it was just a transition of power. The communists simply, agreed to step back in exchange of, that they can keep their property and some money and some influence, which happened actually, because Babiš is a former communist. He also is a former STB, like the state security agent. Anyway, but some of the people still believe it was a pure revolution. It came from the bottom. That the students and the people who were in the streets and were demonstrating, that these were the main reason why the communist regime collapsed. Of course, when you see what was happening in the neighboring countries, it was pretty clear that the Soviet bloc has just collapsed. And that Gorbachev just gave up to maintain the Eastern Europe as the satellite region. But now we are. I'm happy. As I said, when it came, I was 7 years old, so now I can travel, I can talk in America, I can talk in a brewery in Virginia, My father would have never imagined that. So it's perfect for me, but for the older generations, it's difficult. It was more difficult to adapt, to the new development, because they were paid, they had a job. Then they had a pension, and after 1989, they lost some money, they lost some, dignity, they lost some, tradition, because for past 4 decades, they were told what to do, and now, Czechoslovakia was the land of never-ending opportunities, so everyone could have said and done what he wanted to. So for some of the people, it was really difficult, to be in the free country. I think it has changed a bit after 2004 when we joined the European Union. It was great. We were able to as I said, to get billions of euros from the EU budget to build the highways, to protect the environment, to protect our cultural heritage. So it was great. Now, for the past 15 years, we are the EU members. And I think we are, in a great shape. Our unemployment rate is one of the lowest in the European Union. Our industry is working very well, although we are strongly tied to a German economy. So when another crisis or depression comes to Germany, it's in Czechia within few weeks, you know, so we are a bit afraid of that. But still, I think that we have, you know, nothing to be unsatisfied with. Although some of the, you know, older generations, the voters of the communists or of Babiš, they see this a bit differently. Well, it's everywhere, I guess. But come to Czechia, come to Prague. It's a great country, great city. Although it's becoming very pricey, right? Even compared to Vienna or Paris or Milan or other cities in Western Europe. Yeah, as you might have experienced, come in May or in September. Definitely don't come to Prague during the summer, because you'll be, you know, overwhelmed by the Chinese tourists with the selfie sticks. So come to September. In September, there are direct flights from New York or from Philadelphia and from Chicago during the summer season. So come. I'll be happy to, you know, share my contact information, my email. If you come, then I'll be happy to show you the city around. Thank you very much. Take care.